I think we'll have a very interesting discussion. I think all these panelists have done very interesting work in this field, which I represent. But let's hear from them. Peter, do you want to start us off?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm Péter, Partner Managing Director from BCG, primarily focusing on the European telecommunication market. The question of the conference is very valid, and it's about, would the European telecom sector be a trendy investment target again? If I may rephrase this, I think it's a question about, would the European telecommunication sector change its trajectory? Why is that? If you look at how the European telecommunications sector performed in the recent past, it doesn't give rise to a great level of optimism. If you look at it from a shareholder perspective, most of the European telecommunication players actually destroyed value over the last 3 years. And at a median level, it is actually a negative shareholder return. So this is not something that investors would jump on. If you contrast that to globally telcos, so non-European telcos, the situation is actually significantly better. So this is really a European telecommunication issue primarily. Now, it doesn't mean that the digital ecosystem in Europe is suffering overall. If you look at the broader picture, it is actually gaining significant value. It has gained significant value. The issue is that it's accruing certain players which are mostly in the digital services and devices space. And these are, in many cases, companies which don't have European origin. But really the network operators have suffered and they lost quite substantial value over the last years. So this is really the past. The past has not been very kind to the sector in Europe. What is behind this? If we look a bit deeper, we believe that there are 3 underlying drivers. The first one is obviously easy. The macroeconomic environment has not been really kind to this sector, neither to others. Macroeconomic pressures on budget deficits, unemployment, the resulting GDP, and because of that, the limited consumer confidence and limited willingness to spend, especially in some of the southern countries, have hit the sector significantly. But that is not the only factor, obviously. Regulation also had its fair share in resulting in this trend. I mean, obviously we know that there is an MPR reduction that happened and roaming regulation. Those were mostly pressuring the top line. But in our view, there are 3 areas where regulation actually distorted competition to some extent. First of all, there is an over and inconsistent regulation of the markets, hindering especially network owners and operators of capturing fair returns vis-à-vis the access seekers and vis-à-vis OTT players, so those who don't have network. Second, there is a mandated inefficiency in mobile. We call it a mandated inefficiency because in some cases we see, at least in some countries, inefficient spectrum allocation, that is at times focusing on more maximizing the proceeds, or basically pushing players into the market and creating a forced fragmentation, especially in the mobile sector. And the third, as we all know it, there is no digital single market in Europe yet, so there's a lack of European harmonization, which is an issue in itself. But these are 3 factors in regulation that actually pressure the sector. But also there are other aspects, which we could say partially self-inflicted or partially part of how the industry is evolving. And these are around competition and business model. In one sense, this forced fragmentation and the entrance of new players really pressured the sector and created competitive dynamics that are not necessarily sustainable. And we see that usually certain forced players in the mobile markets have really tough time carving out sustainable business models, and they had to resort many times to price wars. On the other hand, as we all know, OTT players, so digital services players, the likes of Google and Facebook and WhatsApp, have started to basically attack some of the revenue and value streams of the players. So these are the 3 factors that really have been, I would say, hindering network operators of creating value for investors. So the question is this likely to change? Is the trajectory likely to change? I think on a macro level, I'm not going to go into an in-depth discussion. I think that we are hopeful that there is going to be some stabilization in Europe. And I will focus mostly on the competition and business model aspect. But maybe let me just share a few words about regulation. And as some of you might know, we actually published a study earlier this year about digital single market in Europe and what we believe are the 5 key changes that are required from a regulatory perspective to get Europe back on track and actually foster investments. And in a nutshell, these 5 are substantial deregulation of fixed wholesale access, because we believe, and you can already see, that there is quite a lot of infrastructure competition, and this slide already. Second, allowing healthy concentration, especially in mobile. As we discussed, there is a fragmentation in the market and unsustainable players, and then the question is, can the industry concentrate a bit also within countries? The third, leveling the playing field for network owners in the OTT, the digital services space, so that there is no differentiation in the future based on the origin, whether you are a network owner or a non-network owner. The next one is spectrum policy modernization. A lot has been discussed about this, and this is really about efficient allocation of spectrum and not forcing new entrants in with discriminant measures. And last but not least, harmonized rules and procedures, which is, I think, one of the key aspects of the digital single market. We believe that these 5 are the most important levers, and we also estimated what kind of cash flow impact would this have for the industry, and especially network players. And as you can see, the free cash flow impact up until 2020 is very substantial, and these could actually unlock some of the funds that are required for next generation access investments, both in fixed and mobile, to at least get closer to the digital agenda targets. So this is the regulatory part. When we talk about competition and business model, I think looking forward, there are a couple of very important aspects to be aware of. One, that there is a clear trend towards convergence and integrated offers between fixed and mobile. This is not a new phenomenon. This has been around for a few years, but it really started getting traction over the last 2 years. And now we see some markets, namely France, Portugal, or Spain in Europe, which have really caught the fever of fixed mobile convergence. And I think we see that many other countries, incumbents, cable attackers, are already looking at, how can they deploy fixed mobile convergence. And this is really successful in these countries that I mentioned. So if you look at Spain, France, or Portugal, in the time frame of 1 to 3 years, these operators have managed to convert 20 to 40% of their broadband customers into these integrated packages. And that is really a fast take-up. Now you could say that this is beneficial for the sector, but in itself, it is not necessarily so. The impact on the market from a value perspective is quite diverging. You have Portugal, where it was primarily offered by the incumbent. It's really a household product and creating stickiness and additional conversion benefits. There we see so far that it is actually increasing the pie and increasing the value for the sector. In the 2 other countries, France and Spain, these offers have actually led to value destruction. These were used as competitive weapons, primarily offering discounts also to individuals, and they are actually, again, limiting the value creation on the market. So I think there's a lot of discussion about integrated offers, but whether these will be beneficial for the sector and beneficial for investors, the jury is still out. Now the other aspect is consolidation. We talked about, I talked about the fragmentation. I think we all know that, especially if you look at mobile, Europe is extremely fragmented. If you look at US, you basically have 4 major players. In Japan, you have 3 major players. And in Europe, you have scattered 100 operators, obviously belonging to several groups, but you have a very high level of fragmentation. And what we see, that in those countries where you have 4 players, in almost all cases, there are already announced or at least rumors about potential consolidation. And it's clear, there are two reasons for that. It's very hard to have a sustainable business model as a fourth or a third player, and very hard to basically do the investments. In the second one, we talked about convergence. Convergence forces players to have fixed and mobile capabilities. And generally that also limits, because you don't have more players in the market who also have these capabilities. So I think there is a clear push, and there is a ripeness for consolidation within country. And obviously then the question is, will regulation and competition authorities allow this? The second aspect, the question is, how much cross-country synergies can be derived? I mean, one of the key aspects of the digital single market is let's harmonize across Europe. And we truly believe that there is benefit to it, and this was one of the 5 key levers that we discussed. But as of now, this is definitely not the most important lever from a business perspective. If you look at the past, those players who had presence across countries did not necessarily fare better than those who were focusing on specific countries. In-market scale has been more important to success. And if you also look at from an investor perspective, based on our calculations, cross-country synergies can amount to high single-digit benefits. And if you contrast that to the acquisition premiums, which are more in the 20 to 50% ranges, you can see that this is an important part of it, but purely based on cross-country synergies, there is basically no way to actually push ahead with acquisitions and M&A activity. So again, M&A activity will be more driven by getting efficiencies within countries and being able to play in the convergence game, and then secondarily based on cross-country benefits. Now, if we go and look beyond consolidation and the convergence, I think there is also a broader question about the business model. And we talked about players from outside basically attacking the business model. And I think it's fair to say that the traditional integrated business model of the telco players is not really sufficient to handle some of the new challenges. We talked about how do you gain synergies cross-country, how do you get new services and how do you integrate them, which is very big in the digital services space, and how do you serve consumers and customers which have very diverging needs and are requiring multi-channel approaches. And finally, you have wholesale models and wholesale models that are non-traditional. And this is not really what the original business model that was invented more than 20 years ago is really catered to deal with. So we as BCG actually believe that this model has to fall apart, and it started falling apart. And there are distinct, different modules of this operating model that have to be treated separately. Let me quickly explain what these are. First of all, there is a service provision model. And I think it already is out there for some players, but this is really, I would say, more of a retailer model than the traditional telco. And you will have different service provider models depending on what segment you are catering to. Obviously, you need different for mass market versus enterprise, or a low-end, no-frills offer versus full service. Second, there is a network owner model, but as you can see, this is a relatively small part overall. This is about building and owning passive infrastructure. This is primarily a real estate business, very different than the other. Then you have a network operator model. So how do you actually operate these networks? How do you operate active equipment? Which is much more of a larger scale, lower margin business. And then we have the digital services business. Obviously, there's a lot of hype about this, and some operators have started gaining traction here. We believe that this is more of a global game, and in many cases, operators will need to partner. They will probably get some of their own developments. But this is, again, a very distinctly different element. And the legacy operations will actually be transforming more and more next generation variant and basically disappearing at the end. Now, why do we believe that you have to break up this model. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the underlying logic and characteristics of these models are very different. So the service provider model, I would say, is rather a Tesco than a telco. So it is really about how can you be the most efficient multi-channel retailer. Asset ownership, as I mentioned, this is truly a real estate business. Basically, how do you find the best investments? Just as the European Investment Bank, you as an investor might want to go for those ones where it makes sense that you have a viable business case. The operations is really much more of a BPO type of business. It's not really a traditional telco play. And OTT development, digital services, I mean, these are internet services businesses where Google's, the Facebook's, the Twitter's play, not the traditional telco space. And if you look at this, again, from certain angles, the scope of these activities are very different. And I think also regulation has to acknowledge this. The service provider business is more of a local/national business. The real estate business is very local, but if you look at operating the network layer or digital services, this is truly an international business. And the financial aspects of these are also very different. You have very diverging CapEx intensity and also related EBITDA margins. I mean, obviously, as a real estate business, you're going to have very high CapEx and therefore high EBITDA margin, but it's vastly different than being operating the active layer of the network. And obviously, because of all of this, the drivers of excellence are going to be very different. And you need different capabilities also as an operator to play in these games. Again, as a service provider, it's rather, how do I beat Tesco, the asset ownership company, how do I beat another real estate company, in centralized operations, how do I compete with, for example, the Tagas of the world, and in OTT, how do you compete with Google? And this is really a different mindset, and we already see that many European telcos have started going down that path with different speeds. So this can unlock value and revenues. What this can also yield is an optimization of the cost base. Based on our calculations, I would say a prototypical telecom player can gain up to 30% or even more OpEx reduction, which is obviously critical from the investor perspective. But we have to admit that this is a very difficult journey. This is a major transformation for telco players, and this is not going to happen in a year. This is more of a 5-year journey. Now, summarizing, if we talk about can Europe change its trajectory, can the European telco sector? If we look at the key levers, from a macro perspective, I think it's pretty clear, a stabilization of the macro environment and the consumer spending and confidence is a critical underpinning of this. From a regulatory perspective, more emphasis on supporting investments, enabling healthy concentration also within countries, leveling the playing field in the digital services space, and fostering harmonization. These are the key elements that need to happen for Europe to get back on track. And for the industry itself, there are also a couple of underlying requirements. In mobile, there has to be a more rational approach, and also an approach to capture the value of data. Second, fixed mobile convergence has to be a vehicle for value creation and not value destruction. Obviously, in-country consolidation can support taking out inefficient operators. And you need to hope and believe and count on that many of these players can actually go through successfully the transformation journey. If these requirements are there, then I think we can talk about a change in the trajectory of the sector. But obviously the question is still out there, then if there is a change in trajectory, and we talk about the trend investment target, who will reap the most benefit? Will this be the Europeans, or will this be potentially investors from outside of Europe? So I think this is something for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Much food for thought there. And we'll get into the discussion in a while. But first we'll hear from, I think, Karim. Do you want to go? absolutely. Great.
Can I get my presentation, please? So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be here again this year. I was asked by the organizer, whom I'd like to thank a lot for this opportunity, to talk about attractive investments. I think my colleague from BCG explained a bit the status. I would go into that in more details, but also giving you a concrete case study on what actually we require to make it attractive. But so far, the situation does not look like that, and I think some of the elements are already shared. So let me start with the first section, which is the value shift in our digital ecosystem. Who are the players, and how is the value shifting? So we heard before that it's actually an attractive business to be in. If you look at the performance, we talked about the last 6 years of a growth of 36%, and these are billions. We're talking about the 30 biggest players in this digital ecosystem in 6 categories. And you could see the categories on the right side, starting with the internet provider, the labels, the IT companies, the device manufacturer, then the equipment vendors, infrastructure, and the telcos, cable operators, as well as network operators, telcos as well as cable operator. So you see from that picture that the one actually that suffered most are the labels, with only 3% growth. From this perspective, the network operator with 26% is not bad. So we should be happy. But let us look in more detail from another angle. This angle is the geographical performance. So it's the same picture. We're still talking about the wonderful growth of 36%. But if you look who is actually growing, it's a different picture from the picture you see before. So here, you see that obviously North America is getting 40% of the growth, or at least growing 40%, but Europe, since 6 years, going down. I think this is a picture you showed before, but this is in conjunction with the other regions. It's quite frightening. So it's not good these days to be in a declining business, and there is no sign, in my view, that this is becoming better. And how often did we organize a conference like this one? How often did my colleague from BCG was invited to speak about the issues, or myself in different contexts, but we're just watching. We're making recommendations, but these recommendations actually are not being considered because we're still in a decline mode. Let me show another perspective now, which is actually linked to the attractivity of these investments. And think of yourself, if you have putting your own money into a division like that, would you do it or not? From a network perspective, operator, look at the left side. This is 2007, the dark blue, and this is 2012. If you look on the left side, on the investments by sector, we see that the telcos and the cable operator are investing most. 64% investing, versus internet, 3, 4, software 4%, 2%, etc. So we're talking about peanuts compared to the network operators. And keep this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, because this is very important, we'll see later on, for the impact of the economy. On the right side, you see the free cash flow out of that. So, a major decline, 34 to 30% in just 5 years. And the picture looks quite attractive not to be a telecom operator if you look at it from a financial perspective. What you invest and what you get back. Let's move on. The market capitalization reflected. We have the equipment vendors. So it's not good to be an equipment vendor today, but we see clear recovery because of the consolidation. It's not the case with the network operator, where it's still bad, and we don't see an improvement so far. Compared to the device manufacturers or the internet provider, so if you look at this picture, and knowing the state of the industry and knowing the state of the operator, you can think of yourself where you put your money in the future. It doesn't look like we achieved a turnaround. It doesn't look like we're seeing a sign of getting better. So, another perspective. Now, please focus on the left side of the slide. You see again 3 regions: North America, Asia, and Europe. North America, you see that you have the 6 segments pretty well established. What's very frightening from the picture is not the difference between 660 billion versus 1,600 billion. It's the fact that we completely missed the digital ecosystem. We're not present. The only area really present significantly, and we saw the picture before, is actually in the network operation. The rest is just negligible. A bit of infrastructure, network suppliers, so to say, the NSN of this world, the Ericsson of this world. But the rest, we're not there. Now, this looks terrible. Unfortunately, the right message is even worse. Because the right message tells you, if this is a factor of 1 to 3, this is a factor of 1 to 7. That is the market capitalization, which is what the investor believes in the future. Things even worse. There is a factor 1 to 7. So the market capitalization of all these companies is 650 versus 3,500. Again, revenue of network operator, not a surprise, -6 compared to the US again, 28%, or Asia, 65%. And here again, the market cap reflected in, so to say, a time-based development. And again, we have not seen the point of inflection yet. We have not seen something going up again, at least from the market cap perspective. So, I think the takeaways are quite clear. I will not go through the list of points summarizing this presentation. I think the graphs were powerful enough to share where we are and where we're heading to. Again, think of one thing, market capitalization. What the investor believes the network operator are worth in Europe in the next years. Now, you may say, okay, we've seen that in the past, etc. So what can we do about it? So let me share with you now, in the second part of my presentation, a concrete case study. This has been just released last Friday in France. And I'm taking France, it could be Hungary, it could be Spain, it could be the UK. I wonder whether the result will be different and whether the recommendation will be different. But I wanted to make it very concrete and share with you what it means to sort of say, go through such analysis and what kind of key message we can take and recommend. So the first element I'd like to share with you is actually what did we do and for whom. In France, there is so-called French Federation of Telecoms, an association that has been founded in 2007, that unites basically all these players, so all the big telcos, but we have also the Virgin Mobile, the Verizons, the Universal Mobile, etc. So content provider and all the major telcos, including the incumbent, SFRs, etc. So it's a body actually that is there to speak to the public sector, government and regulators, as well as a number of parliaments, media, and other bodies. And we have, for the 3rd year in a row, conducted a study on the state of the French industry, what telecom means, and what the impact derived from what we saw before. So the idea is to convey messages, which you will see today, to sort of say these communities I was talking about before. And I think it's very important that we actually share the impact that telecom players may have in the economy, and also I would say reset the mindset of many decision makers in the industry. Because why it's so difficult to improve the investment environment for the telcos and eventually ease the regulation is because everybody thinks that the telecom operator are making so much money. We're talking billions immediately, and we're also talking about huge EBITDA. So they should reduce the EBITDA because they're making too much money. This is a bit, so to say, the mindset that many people have. I'm talking about parliamentarian, I'm talking about, so to say, political people who do not understand really the position and the role of the telecom operator. This is why this federation said, let us do a study to basically reflect what such an ecosystem is actually providing to the French citizen, as well as what value generates for the economy, in terms of direct and indirect investment, in terms of the number of people employed in that industry, etc. So a bit revitalizing, let's say, repositioning what we are actually here for in this ecosystem. So that was the first study. The second study was to look at the, and it's published, everything is published by the way, and when you take notes you will get all the data you want. This is about the focus on the contribution back to the states and what is extracted out of this industry in terms of tax, etc. This year, we reaffirmed, and this was just published a couple of days ago, looking at the business model, the technology impact, and also reinforcing, so to say, the need for deregulation and things that we discussed before in the previous presentation. So these are the key findings. There are 6 summarized. I mean, there are 60 slides on all the kind of detailed analysis. I just selected the most important and translated them, most important key messages. And I will go quickly through each of these messages with one slide. So, things you know already. On the left side, beautiful. We are in industry. If you look at the usage of telecommunication, and this is only France, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at, so to say, the usage, it's a super business. Look at the numbers. Billions of SMS, times 12 in 6 years. Mobile data, times 200. 3.5, times 3.5. 5% increase in fixed voice. Mobile, 28%. All these figures, try to find these usage figures in any other regulated industry, compared to the business we are supposed to be in, because it's extremely attractive from the user perspective. Now, on the right side, ladies and gentlemen, is actually the comparison of all the regulated sector, again, in France. So this is where the regulators are actually managing and intervening and regulating, so to say, the industries. You see 3 points I'd like you to recall. We had an inflation rate in France of 11%, 2006, 2013 estimates. And you could see the gas has increased by 44%. That's regulated in France. The motorway, 17%. Financial service, 9%. The fixed and mobile telecom services went down by 22%. Now, if you add 11 and minus 22, it gives you minus 33%. So actually, for the operator's perspective, the revenue reduced to what the consumer is paying in a growing, so to say, usage environment dramatically. And again, this is only comparing the regulated businesses among each other. So for the other regulators that are here today, think about that, because you are also acting and responsible in this regulated business and in charge of the telecom industry, as others. So now let us have another perspective. It's always good to protect, so to say, the consumer needs and the cost of the service, etc. But it has a cost as well, and we need to think of our industry. I consider myself as a global head of telecom practice, that this is an important industry, and I want to see this industry in Europe particularly prosper. So if you look now at the top 5, the global study was on top 30. This is just focusing on France. 5 telecom operators, 5 network suppliers, 5 terminal manufacturers, 5 content provider, the Canal Plus, TF1, etc., and the OTT. And this is a very interesting perspective. Look at two slides. Two pies. The first one is, on the left one, 69 billion revenue. Huge number. So we're not talking peanuts here. 69 billion revenues in 2012. 61% generated by the telcos. OTT, 10% of it. If you look at the tax perspective, which was the focus last year, 87% tax is paid by the telcos, and only 1% by OTT. Very concrete, one country specific. We can talk about the other slides, the other pies, the investments, which I will come back, and the jobs that were created. So interesting perspective to see actually who is investing, and we saw the return before, and actually who is paying tax, just as a contribution to the government, who is actually supposed to intervene in a regulated business. Now, let us look at another perspective, which is key. What we did, we looked at the future, next 5 years, investments in the telecom sector. Wireless, talking about mainly LTE Advanced of these operators, and we looked also at the FTTH deployment. FTTX deployment, I would say, with some of the cable operators there. There's only one that is quite major. The investments that are considered are between 20 to 25 billions. This is what will happen the next years in France. Now, we're doing with Ericsson for many years a joint study with the University of Chalmers in Sweden, a study on the social economic impact and the impact of broadband, of speed, of value add you have around the broadband, coverage, etc. Increasing the speed has an impact on the GDP. We took these parameters and we're extremely conservative, just applied the numbers to the French GDP. And the investment of 20 to 25 billions is reflected in an increase of 1 to 1.3% of GDP. We have much higher figures. We've seen in industry figures that were announced 3%, etc. We were extremely conservative, very conservative. And despite our conservatism, we were actually looking at 112 to 144 billion value add in the GDP created by these investments. Now, if you look at the tax policy again in France, 43%, 46%, sorry, goes back to the pockets of the government. So we talk about 52 to 60 billions coming back to the government. So if we simplify the equation, and what you should keep in mind is 1 euro investments in a high-speed wireless network generates 6 euro of the GDP, and that leads to 3 euro tax and social security revenue. This is a very simple mathematical equation. So what we needed to do, together with this federation, is to make politicians aware about the role of the telecom operators, about the friendly environment of investment to make this happen. It's a very simple thing. Let them invest, and you'll get the money back. 1 to 3. If you would be an investor yourself, owning a government, I think it's good business, no? So, if we look at what happened the last 6 years, we find out that the turnover, I think this is very known in the industry, going down, had peaked in 2010 to 46 billions, now it's at 44.8 billions. The EBITDA performance peaked in 2008 already and is going down. And I'm sure that many in the room would say 28% of EBITDA is a wonderful business. Why are they complaining? Well, first of all, the investments didn't stop to increase, and actually 2012 was the peak year. 40% of the revenues were reinvested in the industry. If you do the cash flow, EBITDA minus proxy cash flow, EBITDA minus capex, you see how dramatic this has become. So, message one, the economies and performance of the operator is degrading dramatically, but they kept investing heavily. Now, why I'm emphasizing so much on the EBITDA and the performance of the operator? Because, again, if you look at the regulated markets, and you think of the return of investment you have currently in these different regulated markets, and again, in France, you find out that actually, for every euro you invest, the return is 1 over the ROCE, looking at the CAC 40 companies, is 23 years. It's the highest. Luxury 11 years, energy 13 years, and these are legitimate facts. We're looking at what happened in these different regulated industries. How much payback and return of investment you get by when. So remember please. And we have all these cycles. We just finished the coverage of VDSL or ADSL. You again need to invest in fiber. You do not even recover the previous investment. You're already investing in your cycle. You just finished to recover the UMTS deployment nationwide. You're already investing in T. So if you look at the return of capital employed of the telecom operator, it's a long cycle. Why I'm putting so much emphasis on these numbers, 23 years? Because regulation cannot be done in a short term and cannot be changed all the time. Because of these cycles. This is a key consequence, ladies and gentlemen. This is why the investors are not trusting anymore this industry. Because the life cycles are so long, and we keep flipping around, changing all the time. One time it's the European Commission, one time it's whoever, Parliament pushing something, the local regulators, the BEREC, etc. So what I'm saying here is you have too much changes in an industry that requires a sustainable and clarity about investment, because the return of investment are 23 years. Eventually in Hungary it's 15 years only, eventually in the UK it's 18 years, but we're talking about decades, right? So, this again, the perspective on regulated markets and the return of capital employed. Now, why infrastructure is so important? We heard about the GDP, we heard about many other things, economical and social, economical performance. It is important because, actually, it's one of the key platforms to develop the digital ecosystem, because you need efficient networks to be able to push, these are French companies, and eventually become world competitive if you have this condition united. We missed, let's start with the positive thing. We were extremely good, as we heard before, in the mobile. So we led the world and we created a lot of new companies. The Ericsson, the Nokia has become global leaders. And we were leading that wave on the mobile. We completely missed the internet wave. The leaders today are the Googles, etc., as you know yourself. So now, we believe the third, let's say, mega trend and opportunity for growth, and the new leaders in the industry will be the one who will be mastering big data. So playing and knowing how to manage digital content. So cloud computing, big data, etc. So this is why it is very important for a country to have a nationwide, high-performing infrastructure, fixed and mobile. Because if you don't have that, these companies will not be able, autopilot vehicle, for instance, for Renault, right? Why are we only talking about Google cars? Why not about BMW or Renault? But this works only if the infrastructure, in terms of coverage, capacity, performance, is enabling you to test this new business model and to test these new services. So with that, I'm concluding, because you may say, okay, you showed that the importance of the digital ecosystem. What actually are our recommendations? They are twofold. There are two slides. One about the long-term vision to foster productive investment, and one on the regulatory framework. So I will not go through all the details, but just remember the 5 slides. So it's very important. Remember, I was talking about the 23 years of ROCE. We're talking here about providing a predictable and stable framework. This is important to ensure the visibility of investment. And you see multiple elements below that, whether it's a radio spectrum management, whether it's about implementing a roaming framework. This is very important. You're going to change that every year. The second is implement a tax incentive and financial mechanism to foster investment in the telecom field. You've seen who is paying tax and how much tax can be generated if you enable this in mind. It's very obvious. So provide a fair, level playing field. We're not saying nobody should pay taxes. We should all pay taxes. The question is, make sure that it's balanced. Next and final slide. It's about establishing, and I touched it a bit, on the level playing field. Reinforce the confidence in networks in the digital area. Remember, if you don't create a solid infrastructure, you will not have all these startups and the new players coming in, investing, and developing services. And promoting basically the European label. This is what we need to do. And last but not least, as I mentioned, stimulate the development of future digital business through the public authorities. Every euro that we invest, and we've seen it before in the European Investment Bank presentation, that this is very important because there is contribution and this has a leverage effect. So overall, we have done this study many years. I think it would be worth replicating in other countries. You're representative of many countries here. Hopefully we can eventually try to get the same visibility as in France. What the French politicians and stakeholders of this ecosystem get is a 20-page presentation with the details you already have in this one. For 4 slides, so there's a summary, and basically a lot of media coverage, push, debates, etc. So overall, I think the future is quite interesting. It's a high impact, as you could see, high uncertainty, which is wonderful for consultants.
Thank you, gentlemen, for inviting me to the conference and speak here. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Markus Reinisch. I'm the Public Policy Director of the Vodafone Group. I'm responsible for setting the policy for our European, but also our international operation outside of Europe. What I'd like to do in my presentation is to build on what Péter and Karim have already so expertly demonstrated, is the challenges that the European telecoms industry face. And I don't want to say much more about this. I think everybody in this room realizes that the situation is quite dire for us, and the outlook for the next years is equally dire. What I'd like to do is to concentrate more on my regulatory predictions of how regulators and policymakers will address these challenges. And the title of this session is actually called "What Does the Crystal Ball Say?" I don't have a crystal ball. I brought my equivalent. This is my palm reading app, which I've downloaded here. And what I do is just swipe my hand over it, and then I have 2 views of the future. So the one is for next year, rather short-term future. What does the regulatory environment look like then? And the second one is fast-forwarding to the year beyond, 2015. So let me start what I see and in my app. So the first one is I see a new European Parliament next year, which will be elected. This European Parliament will be grappling with the regulation, the single market regulation or the connected continent regulation, as much as the current Parliament is. And the reason for that is that my app says that there will be no consensus between the Council and the European Parliament, this Parliament, on how to address these issues and how to and whether to adopt the connected continent package. So I think the good and bad news for us. I think we will still have quite a lot of work to do next year to shape the regulatory framework that we're currently envisaging to help us out of the situation. The second thing I see is that this package will look very, very different to what we have seen so far. The package will have some improvements, I believe. There will be some of the more intrusive retail regulatory measures might have been taken out of this. I see a package which is not the whole menu. It will be more an a la carte meal, with which I want to say that there will be an unbundling of some of the provisions in this package. And I also think in this package there will be some sweets for some and sours for the other. So I don't think it will be sweet and sour for each of the constituents and people who will be addressed by this. And there's one thing I see as well in this package, and that's very concerning for me personally. The package will not have achieved what we actually set out to do at the beginning when we envisaged new legislation for Europe, and it was exactly to address what we've had before. It's the industry decline. It's the fact that we have to catch up with our much more successful peers in other regions, specifically in the US and in Asia. And we also will not have achieved the creation of an environment, of a regular environment that gives incentives and sustainability to investors, but also to consumers. So what is it in detail which will be there and which will not be there according to my application? I think we will see regulation that bring down the cost of retail roaming for the 20% of our customers in Vodafone who travel and who roam. So that's a positive development for the consumer. I also see that there will be, in one way or the other, some form of additional consumer regulation. May that be directly in the legislation or through a directive which will have to be implemented nationally. That is not so clear. There are also a number of elements I'll be missing, and I think I'll be personally missing, and Vodafone will be missing, regulation to create better and harmonized enterprise access products. There is a high risk that this will not be part of the next regulation. I think that's a shame and it's a missed opportunity, because I see this as one of the few areas where there's a real pent-up demand for pan-European services, which would really drive Europe and the enterprise sector in Europe. What I will not see in my app is the passport. So this is the harmonized authorization possibilities. I don't think that people will be that disappointed. At least I'm not so disappointed that it might not be part of the package. And I'm not so certain, it's not so clear in my app whether there will be provisions about spectrum. And spectrum being an extremely important tool to help the industry to get predictability. We just heard from Karim, we have 23 years investment cycles. Spectrum, which is the core asset of the industry. And I'm not just talking about the mobile industry. Spectrum is needed to drive NGA across Europe in the most cost-efficient and in also the way that is demanded by customers. So we do need spectrum, and we need predictability to invest in spectrum, and we need predictability to invest in the networks that utilize the spectrum. By not having harmonized rules how we allocate spectrum across Europe, we create exactly the uncertainty that we had through the last patch of spectrum auctions, the 4G auctions. So an enormously missed opportunity. I hope that my app will give me a bit more clarity over time, but at the moment it's not completely certain that I think the single most important tool for creating an investment incentive will be part of the package. And the last area where I'm not so certain and I can't see so clearly what the future will bring next year is net neutrality, whether there will be some meaningful harmonized net neutrality legislation proposed in the new Connected Continent package. So it's a mixed bag. It's not the whole menu, that I'm very certain. I see that very clearly. And it probably is not a package that helps the industry. So let me fast forward another year. to the year 2015, so let's say summer of 2015. So what do I see? I see a new commission. And I see all of us. So that's the regulators, that's the commission, it's the parliament, it's the investors, it's the industry representatives, it's the consultants. I think they will be very relieved to hear. It will be all of us still scratching our heads and still thinking very, very hard of how we actually try to achieve what we set out, which is reversing the decline of the telecoms industry, because we will not have fixed it by then. And what I don't see so clearly is whether the Connected Continents package has been adopted or not by that time. But I think it doesn't actually really matter so much, given what the current content is. It will not move the dial in order to create the environment that we need. So what do I see in a year's time? What are we thinking about? What will we be talking about? I think the core thing will be, how do we in Europe get a sufficient scale to compete with our peers? And I think we will have to face one quite uncomfortable area to discuss, and that is consolidation. And if I talk about consolidation, I don't talk about envisaged consolidation which goes across markets. And I think Péter's slides were extremely interesting here, is sort of this very small incremental value, the synergies of cross-border consolidation. And you know, from an operator's perspective, I can only agree with this. You know, and just give you a practical example. You know, just the fact that, for example, Vodafone operates here in Hungary and operates in the Czech Republic doesn't give us the synergies to, for example, open an establishment in Slovakia. And why is this? There is no synergy for us in having office space rented in the center of Budapest or in the center of Prague or on Oxford Street or wherever we are, if you want to rent a retail space in Bratislava. You will have no synergies of having sites in one place. Your marketing costs are very local. And network, and telecoms network, is intrinsically a national network which has national cost. We have enormous cost differentials across Europe. So the cost differential in Europe for labour cost, if you exclude Luxembourg, because if you have Luxembourg and it just goes through the roof, the difference, but it's roughly 1 to 7. If you compare this to another so-called single market, which is the US, where you have a cost differential in labour cost of a factor of 1 to 2 between the richest and the poorest states. So, we are not a single market. So therefore, as long as we are not a single market, we will really struggle to generate the synergies that are required. One of my colleagues actually recommended that whenever I speak about single market, I should do it in Esperanto, to just get my point across. We have intrinsic barriers to single markets. And therefore, I think motivating and encouraging the industry to branch out across borders, I think is very laudable, but it needs much, much more than what we have seen so far. And again, the much acclaimed passport, for example, would not have us got there to create a more investment incentive in other markets. So what we need to address is obviously the in-market consolidation. And I'm not talking about suspending competition law and merger rules and so on. I think this is not what it is. It has to be a very responsible way of how we address how we get market consolidation. And one very obvious discussion that we have to have, and I think it's starting the sort of the roots, not the wings yet, but the roots of this debate are created right now, is that we have to look into the long-term effects of consolidation. So not just into the static efficiencies, to use that common term, but also in the dynamic efficiencies. So what is happening to markets? What's happening to the incentives to invest? What is happening to broadband rollout? What is happening to the speed of broadband rollout, depending on the market structure and the number of players that we have in the market? So this is a debate that all of us will have, and that's what I see very, very clearly next year, but specifically in 2 years' time, when we still see that we haven't achieved what we set out to this year. So in-market consolidation, one of the hot topics for us. And I see another trend, which is quite closely linked to the consolidation in the market, and that is that we have to seriously think about spectrum policy. Spectrum, as I said before, is the most important asset. I know that member states get very nervous when regulators, and especially European regulators, start to talk about spectrum, because there's still sort of this trade-off between short-term revenue gains and long-term sustainable infrastructures and market structures for industry. But it is something that we need to address. And what I think is extremely helpful is that the European Parliament has made, in my view, a very sensible and very broad proposal to extend duration of spectrum licenses. I'm a bit doubtful, and I think my app as well is a bit doubtful, whether these spectrum proposals will see the light of the day and will be adopted at the end of the day. But, regardless whether it's in the package or not, as I said before, this is something that we really have to get our head around. And creating a form of ownership right, so to have either spectrum licenses which have the double the duration of today, which on average about 15 years, and bring them up to 30 years, or even make them indefinite spectrum licenses, will create the dynamic of the market tremendously, because it gives trading possibility, a transfer possibilities of spectrum, and another way for the industry to signal what form of market structure is decided most suited to create the investment that is required. And I think what's also interesting about the spectrum debate and having indefinite or longer spectrum is, this is one area where we're going beyond this benchmarking to other regions. Where all the discussions we have is, the US is pulling away, Asia's pulling away, they're earning more money, they're investing more, they're having broadband deployed much faster into much wider areas. I think that's right, and we should do that, we should continue doing this. But what we haven't done yet is actually trying to figure out what they do better in these areas and why they are more successful. And yes, some reasons are intrinsic, because some of them are, like the US, a much more truly single market than we are. Just a little caveat here, if somebody is interested, they should look into whether there are roaming charges in the US, and you'll be surprised there is actually roaming for US operators as well, if they leave their network. So it's not the perfect single market either, but it's probably the closest to a large single market that we have. So intrinsic problems. There are also, cultural issues like that you have a much higher GDP per person in the US, and therefore you have a much bigger ability to spend. The cost of the network is higher. But there are also things they just have done right, in my view, and that is to have the right spectrum policy, and also, in my view, to have the right market consolidation policy and the right market structure. So let's not just compare, also let's learn from our peers. And my last point is, if, as I said, I can't take any guarantee for the accuracy of these predictions from my app, but if there's some grain of truth in there, I think we have a lot of work ahead of ourselves, especially to consider the consultation questions and the spectrum question. If it's not true, well, I'll just we'll delete my app, and hopefully the consumer protection legislation, but at the point is good enough that I'll get my microphone. So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Markus. So certainly short-term job security for you as well in that space. So Markus, who has an impressive slide deck, but is also extremely good at running through it at a great pace. So please.
Okay, thank you very much. As Magnus just said, I'm going to be going through a fairly huge amount of material. I'll be going through a huge amount of material. When I teach at the Florence School, I like to tell people that there may be a test afterwards. I can't threaten you with that today, but please do hang on. There's a lot that I'll be moving through. Okay, so what I'm going to be covering today is a lot of the topics for the conference: broadband in the EU, coverage, adoption, usage, supply versus demand, is Europe behind, the single market, the connected continent, and some news looking forward. And as a matter of fact, I'm very grateful to the previous speakers, especially to Markus Reinisch, who actually reinforced an awful lot of the points I'm about to make. So here we go. Now, a lot of what I'll be saying is based on 3 publicly available studies that were recently released by the European Parliament. I wrote them as independent studies, or led them for the Parliament. They do not necessarily represent the views of the Parliament, of course. Okay, challenges to the EU. Well, for starts, we've got a regulatory framework that talks about competition, efficient investment, and furthering the internal market for electronic communications, pan-European services, trans-European networks. That's all there in Article 8 of the Framework Directive, but there's more support for a lot of those lines than there are for others. There's hardly anything that you'll find in the text that talks about promoting trans-European networks. It's there as a goal, it's not there actually in the substance of the regulation. Now, what we presumably want from a single market is several different things. We want the ability for service providers to access customers everywhere. We want the ability for end users to access services everywhere. We want to be able to take things with us when we travel. And perhaps most important, we want the economic benefits. We want the scale economies, scope economies, and elimination of artificial barriers to trade, as we really do in all aspects of single market, not just for electronic communications. Now, a key challenge, of course, for European industry is something that the first two speakers talked about a lot, and that is that profitability for many of our companies is, compared to many global competitors, depressed. And it is a problem, and as Markus Reinisch was saying, it really exposes our operators in many cases due to declining profitability to ineffective competition with global competitors. It exposes them to takeovers. What we see actually in several of the proposed or actual transactions in Europe now is European network operators suffering what I call collateral damages as a result of trade conflicts that are primarily Latin American. We see elements of that in the Telefonica Telecom Italia transaction in Plus and also in KPN. So our network operators are exposed. What we also see, and we've seen different indications of this in the previous speakers' slides, is that in a number of areas we see declining investment in capital expenditure precisely at a point where, due to the increased needs for broadband, we would have liked to have been seeing increased investment per capita. So these are problems, they're challenges, they need to be addressed. Now, historically, network regulators have tended to measure success primarily by the extent to which incumbent market share declined and the extent to which telecom prices declined. And I think echoing some of the concerns that you've heard before, which I agree with to a large degree, not entirely by the way, basically in 2003, when prices were probably hugely in excess of cost, bringing prices down was a positive thing. It helped bring them closer to market clearing levels. However, that's a process that's been running since 2003, and I think the question that really has to be asked today is, at what point does that process end? At what point have we squeezed the fat out of the system? Recall, the way that an economist defines societal welfare is the sum of consumer welfare and producer welfare. So simply transferring benefits from service providers and network operators to consumers by itself doesn't, in a static sense, create new efficiency. If you also get increased usage, then you may get advantage through reduction in deadweight loss. But the key question is really how low is low enough? At what point have things run their course? And exactly as Markus Reinisch said, at what point are we sacrificing dynamic efficiency in the form of network investment in order to achieve static efficiency? Historically, that was less of an issue. We're getting to the point where it really needs to be talked about frankly. Let's talk a little about broadband coverage and usage and adoption. So these charts are probably well known to people. These are the 2013 report with 2012 data. As far as coverage, Europe has pretty good coverage, particularly at the basic level. At the basic level, in fact, Western Europe has a nearly full coverage of broadband, less so in the East, in the member states that were previously behind the Iron Curtain, where we never had a fully deployed fixed network. So that's the challenge on the basic broadband side. The next generation access, or fast and ultra-fast broadband, is here. There we have an almost reverse picture. Some of the newer member states are actually deploying faster than the older ones because they didn't have a copper network and there's no reason not to leapfrog. But clearly we do have some investment challenges. When we look, however, on the adoption side, we get a somewhat different picture. A recent UN report noted that of the top 10 countries in the world for broadband adoption, 9 of them are European. Of the top 20, 16 are European. Now, we see differences in how that penetration is achieved, Obviously more fiber in Japan and Korea than some places, but how much does that matter? Traffic also needs to be understood. Usage needs to be understood. We don't build these networks just to have them. We build them so they can be used. Traffic clearly does grow year over year. The rate of growth, however, declines year over year. This is based on Cisco data. It's not surprising. Anybody who's familiar with technology adoption curves know that they tend to follow S-shaped curves. The decline over time is to be expected. If you look at average household use on a per hour basis, during peak hour actually, it turns out to be a lot lower than most people would think. Even as late as 2020, if you extrapolate it forward, you come up with numbers on the order of 2 megabits. That doesn't mean that 2 megabits is all you want. When you want the bandwidth, you want it. And of course, there are big differences from one household to the next. But there's much more scope for statistical multiplexing than most people would assume, and therefore much more scope for alternative technologies, including cable, of which Europe has substantial coverage. This is OECD data based on Akamai. It's based on delivered speed rather than access speed. It's presented a little differently than the OECD does. Here again, you see Japan and Korea have far more subscribers that have access to speeds over 10 megabits. That's what the dark blue represents. Europe's still up there, but when you actually look at usage tendencies and at delivered bandwidth, you get a somewhat different picture. On the right here, you have delivered bandwidth, not access speeds. These are from speed test and Ookla. And you see Japan and South Korea are faster than many European countries, not as much faster as you would expect. This is bandwidth consumed per household, per fixed subscription, based on Cisco data. And the trends are not at all what most people would expect. Most people would assume that where you've got faster bandwidth, you'll also see higher usage. It's not uniformly true. The United States, which has lower delivered bandwidth than many European countries, has far higher consumption. The light blue part of the bar represents video, and of course that's a big chunk of it. This is probably the Netflix phenomenon. And interestingly enough, the United Kingdom, the UK, has more bandwidth usage than Japan, even though it definitely doesn't have faster networks than Japan. So again, when you look at this, the assumption has been that deploying fast broadband quickly would result in an explosion of usage. The data doesn't seem to substantiate that, or at least it doesn't consistently substantiate it. Now, as far as supply measures versus demand, also important to consider why people use the internet and why they don't use the internet. We have survey results on this. Eurobarometer surveys 5,000 households per member state per year. It's a reasonable presumption today that people who don't have broadband choose not to have broadband. And it turns out that of those who don't have it, for about 2/3, the main reason is that nobody in the household sees the value of broadband. Interestingly enough, 7% don't subscribe because they don't know what the internet is. I find that a little incredible for Europe today, but both of these statistics suggest that there's a lot more room than we tend to think for increasing digital literacy and for trying to pull usage rather than merely push it. And with that in mind, this rather nice study done by some of my colleagues at the Florence School of Regulation did a regression study on most European member states and found that demand stimulation measures had greater effect overall in increasing penetration than did things on the supply side, like public-private partnerships and such. All of them had positive effects, and they tended to have larger effects. Interestingly enough, the Florence School folks did what's called a quantile regression, and they found that among member states with lower penetration, the supply side measures were more effective. In member states with high penetration, the demand side effects were much more effective, demand side stimulus, which makes sense when you think about it, and it suggests that for most of Europe today, we probably ought to be paying far more attention to demand side issues, video issues, digital literacy issues than we tend to. Dealing solely on the supply side is perhaps a little like pushing on a rope. We also need to somehow get behind and pull. Anyway, there's been a lot in the press, a lot of concern that Europe is falling catastrophically behind. I think the data doesn't entirely substantiate that. It's clear that we don't have as much fiber deployment as we would like. That's not necessarily a problem as long as we continue to pay attention to it and continue to move forward. Speed of broadband access is an enabler but it's one of many. It's by no means the whole story. Now, let's move on to these single market issues. And what are we really trying to get with single market? The Commission obviously had a view. It's visible in the impact assessment that they developed. They talk about inconsistent national authorization schemes. They talk about lack of coordination in spectrum assignments. They talk about lack of pan-European network access inputs. And they talk about high prices for roaming. Well, some of those may be causes. I wouldn't exactly say that they're root causes. But many of them, most of them, do deserve some attention. So, authorization. The Commission alleges inconsistent national practice that impedes European market entry. There's actually nothing in their impact assessment or anything else that would substantiate that. They do document some problems with spectrum, but those aren't authorization problems, they're spectrum problems, and they should be dealt with as spectrum problems. We've conducted studies, others have conducted studies. Getting the authorization by itself isn't the big problem, and the solution that was proposed here is unwise and unwieldy. There's a much easier way to deal with this. A standard form in 1 or 2 or 3 standard languages so that the operators can simply send the same form to all member states, which effectively maintains maximum requirements, is an obvious way to deal with it. It was independently proposed by BEREC. It makes sense. There are a couple of points where the Commission noted excessive payments for authorization. Those, again, could be dealt with 2 one-line changes in the existing directives. You don't need the extraordinarily complex mechanisms that the Commission put forward. As far as harmonized access products, it's a more complicated story. There, the Commission put forward several. They put forward a virtual unbundled local access, a wholesale broadband access, terminating segments of leased lines, and an assured service quality product. Well, our feeling was that these ideas are directionally appropriate. They didn't really distinguish business from residential requirements. They didn't actually prioritize these. There's a lot of complexity in some of the solutions like rule and some questions as to whether you really want to use the same solution for all member states or whether it's appropriate everywhere. And in regard to assured service quality, it's not at all clear what they're proposing, why they think it's needed, what problem it's meant to solve. We don't think that that was at all backed up with any reasonable justification. Spectrum management was clearly one of the strongest parts of the proposal. And also I would say that within the Commission is probably one of the strongest groups, one of the most competent groups. There have unquestionably been delays in getting the 800 megahertz spectrum out to the market. And with the 700 megahertz band likely to become available after the work in 2015, it's incredibly important that we not go through the same delays. So somehow ensuring that the spectrum is released in a coherent way is extremely important in our view. The recommendations here are clearly in the right direction, and we would hope that those could be put into practice sooner than a full review of the regulatory package. And at this point, I think there's a good chance that that will make it through with whatever remains of Connected Continent. And at least that's my hope, and it's also what we encouraged in our report. With net neutrality, this is an issue that different sensible people will tend to have different views on. Our feeling was that the concerns the Commission raised about having too many different approaches in the different member states is a real concern. We felt that the Commission's proposals, again, were directionally right. We hope that some form of this goes forward. Roaming is probably the area that's gotten the most attention, and I think the area that's least understood. What the Commission proposed was roaming alliances that have to eventually cover all member states. They're supposed to offer prices comparable to domestic, whatever that means, in exchange for which the network operators would get freedom from price controls and freedom from the need to implement or support structural solutions. They also pushed for additional reductions in roaming prices, for calls received, which is interesting, and also controls on international calls. I tend to view the international calls and the roaming as being closely related issues. That's why I'm treating them together here. Now, the approach to alliances, in our view, is extremely unlikely to get anywhere. If anybody in the room has a different view, I'd be happy to hear it. There are high transaction costs in putting these alliances together. The interests of the network operators are by no means aligned. in any pair of countries, one will be a net payer and the other will be a net receiver. They don't have the same interests. It's not easy to put these deals together. And there's basically no incentive for the mobile network operator to do this. What are they getting? They're getting freedom from price controls by pricing below the controls. They're getting freedom from implementing the structural solutions after they've already sunk the cost of doing it in 2014. And they're getting freedom from competition, which the Commission probably already wrecked by making this proposal in the first place. So basically there's no incentive. The deals won't be entered into. And it basically becomes a massive time sink for everybody, in my judgment. Now, in terms of the calls received, it's important to remember that things work differently for calls received than they do for calls placed. This is a figure from RCEP in 2006. I think everybody knows that when one is roaming in country B, you make a retail payment to your home operator. There's a wholesale payment to the operator in country B. For calls received, it doesn't work that way at all. There is no conventional wholesale payment. For the home network operator, the call is placed to the home network operator and forwarded to the visited network. So the home operator receives an MTR from the caller, or receives retail revenue if it's on net, pays an MTR to the visited network. The difference in those two MTRs is what's decisive for profitability. Now, in the current roaming regulation, the strength is that they kept the prices and the costs together and closely linked in a single instrument. What you have here is MTRs that are different. There we go. Different among the member states. These are Commission data. They're less different than they were, but they're still pretty different. There's a 4-to-1 difference between the highest and the lowest, even if we ignore Luxembourg, which here, as for labor costs, is kind of an outlier. But it says to me, if the company is going to be losing 3-to-1 on every minute of calls that they connect, will they in fact connect the calls? I think it's an open question. This doesn't seem to me to be the way to promote the single market. So what needs to be done is a much more comprehensive and integrated approach. The international calls are being treated through a separate instrument than the roaming regulation in the Commission's proposal. It's treated for reasons that escape me as consumer protection, with no consideration of underlying costs. The roaming regulation is a separate instrument, and then the termination rates would presumably stay where they are in the existing access and interconnection directive and in the recommendation of termination rates. Spreading these things in 4 places doesn't seem to me to be the best way to get a coherent solution. So again, our recommendation for this is that what's needed is a much more integrated approach to all of these elements that considers costs and prices in an integrated way. More broadly on the package, it potentially introduces an awful lot of complexity and greatly degrades the coherence of the existing package. The existing framework is a nice, neat, simple, hierarchical package. If you change something in the Universal Service Directive, it's pretty unlikely that you will unintentionally break something in the Authorization Directive. There's a clean partition. To me, it's a lot like a structured computer program. And conversely, if you look on the right, if you look on the right, you see that the new pieces extensively overlap the old, but in ways that are hard to disentangle. It would be fairly easy to have unintended interactions, both initially and also over time as the system is maintained. So our broad sense is that the proposed change, if implemented in full, degrades the simplicity, the comprehensibility, and the integrity of the framework as a whole. Now, at the moment, the movements in the Parliament look like the package will be massively pared down. That's a good thing. It's probably the best hope that we have of avoiding a spaghetti tangle of regulation that will make the whole system harder to manage. We looked at individual pieces. I won't go through the details here, but different parts of the proposal differ greatly both in their effectiveness and also in their coherence. Our overall recommendations: radical simplification of the package needed. Useful elements of Connected Continent should move forward and should move forward sooner than an overall review of the framework. And in that I very much agree with Markus Reinisch. They all need a little work. I don't think there's any article in Connected Continent that I would recommend putting into place exactly as it was written. But there are parts of it that are directionally right and that I think should move forward in some form. Okay, now, one or two last points. One of them has to do with consolidation. Here, too, actually, I'd like to echo some of the comments that Markus Reinisch made. These were some of the areas that aren't touched at all in the Commission's proposal, but that really have to be dealt with if we're going to talk about profitability of European network operators. And how can you talk about pan-European services without talking about consolidation? But again, cross-border consolidation implies quite different issues from same-country consolidation. Both of them need a harder look. In regard to in-country consolidation, it really raises profound questions. What level of profitability do we think is appropriate for our network operators? What benefits flow from trans-European networks? Are they still relevant? What profitability? What are the implications for those single market states? This becomes, of course, especially relevant for the proposed 4-to-3 mobile entries, mobile mergers, but also raise questions. Should the spectrum management authorities be working like heck to introduce a fourth market player every time that we have a 4-to-3 merger? What effect does that actually have? The results, in fact, in the literature are somewhat ambiguous. Okay, so, overall looking forward, my general take, Europe is doing reasonably well, especially in terms of broadband. It's doing better than many of us would like to think. We still do need to make a lot of progress in terms of achieving the single market for electronic communications. The existing initiative dealt with only a limited number of the issues using a limited number of instruments. A much broader look is required. And for that reason, a considerable body of work will be needed, not really just by the Commission and the Parliament, but clearly by the Commission and the Parliament after the next elections. But also by BEREC, also by the national regulators, also by the market players, also by the consultants, of which I am one, and I was left out there. And so I think that we've got our work cut out for us and much to be done. And with that, I'm happy to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Soós. Well, what an interesting set of presentations. I am, again, looking at my watch, and I know we will done with coffee and a short leg stretch. If there are any burning questions, I'm happy to take one or two learnings.
I would like to thank all the speakers for their very elucidating presentations. I have a question to any panelists that be willing to respond. And namely, this question has to do with the interplay of regulations emanating from other sectors, like the privacy regulations, as regards the feasibility of the connected content package. Let me be more explicit. We all know that from all operators, European operators, we have one panel, are sitting on a big, let's say, amount of data, personal data, that if used in a meaningful way may help them go up the value chain and become OTT providers to some extent. But on the other hand, we see some trends emanating from the recent incidents regarding the surveillance monitoring, the NSA and the PRISM incidents that are going towards fragmenting the internet and protecting to some extent the European boundaries, as some operators claim, by fragmenting the internet, creating some European walls, walled gardens, and so on and so forth. So my question is, do you think that this is compatible with the digital single telecom market vision, or do the data protection legislation be amended, but in a way that, on the one hand, strengthens the protection of European citizens and businesses from surveillance, and on the other hand, allows companies to gain access to those data which are vital for their business models, especially as regards the big data trend? So I would like to get your views on this, on this dichotomy, maybe.
I think it's a good question, Leonidas, and one we grapple with, and I
think your assessment is very correct. We, as telecoms operators, sitting on a treasure trove of data, but we're also aware of the responsibility that we have as a telecoms operator. You know, we are not a traditional OTT in that sense, because we hold, you know, we know who our customers are. I think that's just the simple way to do this. So I don't necessarily see that there is a lack of a level playing field here. As long as we all agree, and that's OTTs and us, that consent is sort of the key pre-requirement for using customers' data. And we take this very seriously because we have a lot of trust to lose with our customers. I think the key is the implementation. So the rules on privacy specifically, I think that is broadly correct. Yeah? I think we should have a discussion in the privacy directive on how you get consent and so on, but it has to be implemented equally across the value chain. I think that is much more the point. The lack of level playing field, I think, is much starker in other areas, where services are provided that look, feel, and smell like telecom services, but are not treated like telecom services. I think that's where this comes into play. But on privacy, that's a too sensitive subject to, for example, argue that telecoms operators should have less privacy requirements in order to harmonize with other OTT operators. I think we're pretty much right there, with some possible improvements in terms of how do you get consent and what do you get consent for.
Thanks. I did see a hand waving. Very quickly, answer.
Just a very quick word. I really agree with what Markus Reinisch said once again. I happen to be the expert witness against the U.S. government for the illegal wiretapping done by the NSA during the Bush years, so I happen to have strong feelings on this. But I think it's important to remember that interception for national security purposes is done for different reasons and in quite different ways than interception for law enforcement purposes, and also in quite different ways than commercial privacy kind of considerations. And there is a risk here of an overreaction, and we should carefully guard against that.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I did see one hand waving. That will be the last question. Yeah, please. If you can introduce yourself.
Frank Klaus from Telenor, and I'm actually going to take this opportunity to go both to the previous session and this one. Thank you very much for the good presentations, especially to Mr. Markus, who showed that above certain speeds, it really doesn't help you get additional penetration. And also to Mr. Gruber, who showed that the EU is doing a great thing to close the digital divide, and that the EIB is going to put in a significant amount of billions of euros in to help this, I think, is a great thing. What I don't understand, and what I would like to get some help from the experts here, is to why we feel that this needs to be done by fiber. Mobile broadband internet is a clearly much more efficient way to reach the rural areas of Europe. The market is pushing in this direction, and while the EIB is pushing a huge amount of money in to try and level out the externalities about the repayment, governments are taking a huge amount of money out of the mobile industry through 800 spectrum auctions. And I believe that there should be some way to lower the amount of money expected to be taken out of the industry in 800, specifically with coverage requirements so that the rural areas are covered with this. Can someone please comment as to why the huge focus on fiber out to the very last household in Europe?
Thanks. Markus, do you want to start us off?
If I kick off, so, I agree with the implied statement that there's obviously not a need to connect every holiday home in Europe with a fiber connection. There can't be an economic value in this. I think there's a role for fiber in Europe. And that's a role to create the basic infrastructure, technology-neutral basic infrastructure that brings fiber as close as possible to customers. And I think Finland is a very good example for this, where the universal service obligation is to, I think it's to have 100 megabits within 1 or 2, I can't remember exactly, 2 kilometers of every customer in Finland. I think that is very smart, and that's the role that fiber can play. But as you rightly say, fiber is not the most efficient way to deploy networks. I think the added point is deploying fiber where it is not necessarily needed with public money. I think that's an even bigger problem, where you have private investment in the real next generation access infrastructure, which is mobile, which is meeting the demands
as Scott just showed before, of all our customers for now and for the future. There's another very interesting report by the Communication Chambers, which is predicting sort of from bottom up what customers actually really need over the next 10 years, and the results are very similar to what you have actually shown before. So I think mobile is the NGA technology of the future. We need to do much, much more to promote mobile, and we have to promote fiber where it supports mobile and where it, in a technology neutral way, supports other forms of next generation access deployments as well.
Thanks. Alright, do you want to comment on that? Or, yeah, and then we'll wrap up with Scott.
Yeah. Now, just to address one thing, I don't want to have created the impression that EIB is just pushing fiber. That's not at all true. I mean, EIB is, in that sense, technologically neutral. I mean, fiber certainly satisfies the requirements of the digital agenda concerning 100 megabits and more. But there are also other technologies to do that, and we, in our simulations, we have included in a cost-efficient way what is the most appropriate technology. The problem with mobile technologies is that they are still some way off the 100 megabit target, so that it still, I mean, it is a contentious technology in the sense it depends how many users. So it's a shared technology, whereas with fiber you have less that problem. So you have to make another number of assumptions about how many are using at the same time in the system. As you know, it's a shared technology in that sense, mobile. So in that sense, clearly, the bill is varying, but you have to make assumptions on it. But it's just to say, it's not just fiber.
Scott, you got a 20-second slot, and then we'll break it up.
Okay, well, I've always been a big fan of technological neutrality. I think cable gets far less attention actually than it deserves in this context. At this point, the majority of fast access in Europe is cable. Mobile definitely has a place for areas that are sufficiently low density. You wouldn't really use it as a substitute in the center city, but rather as a complement. I think we also forget that for a small fraction of the European population, like 1 or 2%, satellite is probably the right solution. The key question is, how much competition do we want to foster? A study, for example, by the European Investment Bank assessed the cost of reaching digital agenda for Europe objectives using a mix of fiber and cable. But the question is, are we satisfied to stop with one physical medium in that case, or do we want two for competitive reasons? Unresolved question. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you so much to our panel. It's been a great debate this morning. We're running